Welcome to the Daily Plunge. We are in the prophet Zechariah, chapter 12, verses 1 through 14. We have the prophecy of the Lord, from a word from him. Which Lord? The Lord that created all the starry hosts, the sun, the moon, the stars, the planets, right? The Lord who created the earth that we're standing on. The Lord that formed in us, he says, the spirit, our intellect, our will, our emotions, and our spirit, our spiritual hunger. And he says that he will make Jerusalem a cup of commotion for all the peoples that are besieging it, all the enemies against it. They think they're going to devour and drain Jerusalem, but instead they will become the ones who are staggering and intoxicated, and drained and devoured. It goes on in verse 3, on that day. And we see this eschatological phrase in verse 4, 6, 8, and 9. It means in that eschatological moment, end time moment, not necessarily a 24-hour day, the Lord is working to bring about his salvation promises, right? He says, I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone so that all who wanted to get rid of it, they'll end up being crushed by it. Now we know when we read prophecies that Jerusalem, Israel, Judah, these are a reference for God's people, and God's people is the church, right? And the Lord is going to strike terror into the hearts of the enemies. The horse and the rider are panicked and filled with madness so that they cannot continue. They lose confidence. But God's people, right? They are going to be strong, not because they're trusting in horses or weapons, right? But because they trust in the Lord God Almighty, as it says in Zechariah chapter 4, verse 6, not by might nor by strength, but by the Spirit of the Lord. It goes on in verse 6 to say, on that day, I'm going to make the people of God like a furnace amongst wood, a flaming torch amongst a bunch of straw. And we think these enemies of ours are so powerful, but God says they're nothing more than wood and straw, and they will be lit on fire. And what's that fire? It's this power of the Spirit, right? And, the church is going to remain safe. And it is the tyrants and the regimes and all the opponents of the church that have faded away over and over again over more than 2,000 years. In verse 7, we hear that the Lord how he's going to save the dwellings of Judah first. And verse 7 is about how there will be no pecking order amongst the people of God, that all will be honored. Sort of like what Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, when he says every member is of equal value to the Lord. He goes on in verse 8 to say again, on that day, the Lord will be a shield. And what is that spiritual protection that the Lord gives to us? It is faith, so that in the midst of sin, we find God's righteousness. In the midst of bondage, we find freedom with God. And in the midst of death, we find victory. And he goes on in verse 9 to set out, he's going to take down all the nations that attack the people of God. And that, he says, on that day, verse 10, I will pour out a spirit of grace and supplication. He's speaking about the joy and the worship of God's people. And when is that day? It is the day when they look on the one that they have pierced, as one does, and they're going to mourn for me as one mourns for an only child, grieve bitterly for a firstborn son. And who is this a reference to? It is a reference to Jesus Christ, who was pierced on the cross, right? And that this mourning will be over the entire land and every family, and they will mourn so penitently for their mistreatment of God that they will bow down to God in faith, just like we do on Good Friday. Thanks, friends. Have a blessed day.